So over here, I'll be explaining my code. So over here, I've generated a client provided Prisma client JS. This just generates the Prisma client for interacting with the database. Here I have data source DB provider and URL. This just defines the database connection using SQLite and the environment variables for the URL. Over here, I have user model. This is just a user model representing the application users. Here I have ID as the primary key, name is the name field, email is the email address, password is the hash password. Task for one-to-many relationship, and then the timestamp when it was created. I have the same thing for the task model, so it just represents individual tasks. The ID is the primary key, the title is the description of the task, the completed boolean, whether the task was completed or not, the user ID, which is the foreign key, the user, which is the relation to the user model, and then the timestamp when it was created. Moving on, I have my client TS in a DB folder. So you have import Prisma client. This is the import for the Prisma client class from the generated Prisma client package. And then over here I have export Prisma new Prisma client. This is just to create a single instance of the Prisma client. Here I just have all my necessary imports. And over here I have the export cons auth options. This just defines some export configuration options. And then over here I have the providers, which is to configure the authentication providers with the name, the credentials, the email, and the password. Here I have async authorized credentials. It's just a custom authorization logic for validating the user's credentials. And then here at the bottom I have if no credentials or email or password return now. It just ensures that the email and password are provided. Over here I have cons user where Prisma user find unique where email credentials email. So this is the lookup is about the email in the database, and over here it says if there's no user, return now. So if the user is not found, deny access. Over here I have cons valid await backup compare credentials password user password. This just compares the provided password with the hash password in the database. Here I have if it's not valid, return now. So if the password is not valid, deny access. And then it's over here it says return user, so this is going to return a user if everything went through successfully. Here I have session synergy JWT, that just configures the session handling and it uses the JSON web token instead of the database session. And then over here I have the pages sign in login, that just redirects the user to a custom login page. And then I have the export default next auth, which will just export the next auth with the defined options. Here I have my necessary imports. This is my IDTS file. So this is how the delete button works. Here I have export default async function handler request response concession await get session request response all function. This is the default export API router handler for the class deletion. Here I have if there's no session or no user or no email is found, it will return a response status of 401 with the error message saying not authenticated. Over here, I have cons user await Prisma find unique with the email session. So this will just look up the user in the database by their email. Over here, I have if the user doesn't exist, return a 401 with an error message saying user not found. Here I have if request method equals to delete, const task ID number query ID. So this will just handle the delete request from removing the task, and it also extracts the task ID from the query parameters to convert the number. And then over here I have if no task ID return response 400. So this is just to validate the task ID, it must be a valid number. And then here I have await Prisma task delete mini where ID task ID user ID. So this is just going to delete the task belonging to the authenticated user. Here I have return response status 204 in an end. This will just return a 204 with no content, meaning it's a successful deletion. And then lastly, I have the return response status 45 and if the request method is not deleted, it will return a 45 method not allowed. Over there, I have my necessary imports. So here I have export default async function handler request response if the request method equals a post return response status 45. So only post request is allowed after the request will be rejected with a 45 method not allowed. And then over here it says const email name password request body. That is just going to extract the name, the email, the password from the request body. Here I have a validated. So if there's no email or if there's no password, return a response that is 400. Email and password is needs to be provided. Over here I have const existing user await Prisma user find unique where the email, and if it's an existing user, return a status form 9 user already exists. So this is just going to check in the database whether the user with the same email already exists. Yeah, if const hash password await bicrypt hash password, and so it's just a hash password with bicrypt, sorry. And then over here I have const user await Prisma user create data name email password. So this is just going to create a new user record in the database. And then over here I have return response status 201 message user created. This is the response we will get if a user is being created successfully with the user ID. So now moving on to my task DS, I have all my necessary imports. Here is the export default async function handler request response const session await get server session request response auth options. So this is just going to retrieve the current session using the next auth. Here it says if no session or no user email is found, return a 4.1 status. Here it also has const user wait Prisma find unique for the email and the user's email, so look up for the user in the database by the email. Here it says if the user does not exist, return a 4.1 user not found. Here is where we handle the GET request, so it's going to fetch all the tasks for the authenticated user. Here it will return a 200 okay, everything went through successfully. And then here I have the post methods to handle the creation of new tasks. So here, if there's no title, return a 400 JSON, which is a validator to say that the title is required. And then over here it says const new task by Prisma task create with the title and the user ID. This is just going to create a new task linked to the authenticated user. And then over here I have the return response status 201 JSON new task. This is just going to return the newly created task with a 201 created status. And then over here it says if the request method is not a get or post, return a 4.5. Okay, moving on, I have my login TSX. Over here I have the const email, const password, and the const error. So, and it also has a use state. So this is just going to store the email and the password in a state. Next, I have the const handler submit async Rec form prevent4. This is just going to handle the login form submission, and the prevent4 prevents the page from reloading. Here I have const rest await sign credentials, redirect false, email and password. This is going to attempt to sign in the next auth credential provider. The redirect false is the disable automatic redirect, and then the email is the email that the user provided as well as the password. Here I have my if and else statement. So if res error, set error, invalid email or password. So this means if the sign in returns an error, show the error message. And then the else block just says router or push. So if everything went through successfully, like the login, it will redirect the user to the task page. Next, I just have my container for my login form. So here is my heading. This is my input field for my email, my input field for the password, my button to click to log in, and then if something goes wrong, it will display the error message, and then a link to the register page if I did not create an account. Over here, I have the register page. So here I have const name, const email, const password, const message, all stored in a use state. So it will just store all the user's information. And then over here, I have the const handle some async. This will just handle the form submission. And then prevent default, which will prevent the page from reloading again. Here I have my try block. So here I have const await fetch, API register, the method is post. So this is just going to send a registration back into the API. Sorry, the registration data to the backend API. And then over here I have my catch. Sorry, before I go into the catch, I have consider wait this JSON, set message, data message, or data error. So pass response and let feedback and set the feedback message, and then the catch block if something does go wrong, it will just show a message saying something went wrong. And then I just have my container, my input field for the register page, where my heading will be, my input for my this is for my name, the input for my email, the input for my password, the submit button in the form, and then the message, a feedback message that will be displayed, and then a link to the login page. Over here I have my task DS. So here I have the ID, number, title, which is string, and completed boolean. So this is just going to define the task type of what is required. Here I have export default function task. This is the task component that handles the displaying, the adding, and the deletion of the task. And then I have const task set task, const loading, set loading, and then new const new task set new task. And they all stored in a local state. So and then over here I have const fetch task async. This will just fetch all the tasks from the backend API. The const test awaits fetch API is a GET request to the task API. The const data is await registration is the pass JSON response. The set task data is to update the task state, and then set loading will hide the loading state. And then I have the user fetch task. This will just fetch a task on the component mount. Over here, we have const handle task async. So if a new task is trump, this will just prevent an empty task submission. And then it says here await API, await fetch API, the method will be a post, and it gives you the headers and the body information. And then here it says set new task. This will just clear the input field, and then fetch task will refresh the task list. And then over here, this is how we delete a task by its ID. So I have const and the delete async ID number. And then a method will be a delete, so it'll just send a delete request to the backend, and then it'll fit the task or refresh the task list. And then this is if loading return the paragraph, so it will just show a loading state while fetching the task. And then over here, I just have my task container with the heading, the input field, the task list, and then whether the task was completed or not, and then the delete button over here. Over here, I have my auth Here I have export cons auth options. This is the next auth configuration options. Here I have my provider, which is the credential providers that allows the login and the email password. So as we can see, the email and the password for the login form. And then here I have a sync credentials. If there's no email, if there's no or if there's no password, return a null. So it must ensure that both email and password are provided. And then here I have cons user wait Prisma user find unique for the email credentials. So this will just look up the user in the database by the email. If there's no user found, return null. That is when the login fails. And then here it says const is valid await pipedrive compare. This will just compare the provider passwords for the hash password in the database. And then over here it says if the password is not valid, if the password is not valid, return null. And then if everything does go through successfully, it will return the user. Over here I have session strategy JWT, user JWT base session instead of the database session. And then over here, pages sign in login. This was just the custom sign in page route. And then here I have my export default. This will just export the configuration for the next auth. Lastly, I have my DBTS. So over here, I have cons global for Prisma global. This is unknown Prisma. This is to create a global variable to store the Prisma client instance. And then over here, I have the export cons Prisma global for Prisma and new Prisma client log query error. So it exports a single Prisma client instance. If one already exists in a global Prisma, reuse it. Otherwise, create a new Prisma client with logging enabled for queries and errors. Over here I have if process in vnode in v production global for Prisma. This is in developer mode. Store the Prisma client in the global object. This ensures hot reloading doesn't create multiple instances. And that is it for my backend.